we are continuing in the story of Genesis. We're looking at the story of Jacob this morning. From chapter 32, I'm going to cheat a little and back up a bit to the beginning of, I think it's 31. Or maybe, no, it's all in 32, but it's on page 23 of your Bible if you want to follow along. That's where we're going to start. So most of you know that my husband is a firefighter, and one of the things that you may not know about firefighters when they are fighting a fire, that as they are moving through someone's home, one of the things that they are doing in the cleanup process is looking for items of sentimental value. Because when a fire happens, first of all, there's the destruction of the fire, but there's the added destruction of the smoke and also the water damage. And so even in rooms that were not affected by the fire can be affected by the smoke and the water, and sometimes it's like a total annihilation of a family's belongings. And so firefighters will look for, as they're doing cleanup, like family photos or wedding photos, and they'll kind of tuck those aside and present them to family members after a fire. Because when you have lost everything, there's something deeply meaningful about having something of value that you can cling to. And I want us to have that image in our heads this morning as we enter into this story of Jacob. We talked last week that Jacob was on the run from his uncle Laban, and now God has told him to return to the land of Canaan. But on that journey back, he and his uncle Laban kind of had a showdown moment where Laban built a structure of rocks and said, this is the boundary marker between you and I. We'll each stay on our own side, because if we were to cross that side, or this tower of rocks, we might be inclined to harm one another. And I said last week, that's not something you say unless you really want to harm the other person. So these were parting words between Jacob and Laban, and so Jacob is moving away from Laban because Laban wants to harm him. He's heading back into the land of Canaan, where, as you recall, the last time he saw his brother Esau had told him he wanted to kill him. So what I want us to see this morning as we're beginning is that Jacob is essentially caught between two people who want to harm him. He's moving away from Laban and back toward Esau. But this is this moment where he really is stuck between two people who want to cause him harm. On his way, Jacob, in the beginning of chapter 32, is on his way to Canaan, and he sees the angels of God. The angels of God met him on the way. Now, this is meant to mirror for us in our heads the story of Jacob fleeing from Canaan, where he saw the stairway to heaven, the angels ascending and descending. So that was on his way there. Now on the way back, he's met by angels again. And when Jacob saw these angels, he said, surely this is the camp of God, because he sees these angels in some sort of military camp. And this occurs to him that this is the camp of God, and he names the place Mahanaim, which means two camps. So scholars debate what he means by two camps, but basically I think the best way to think about it is the camp of God and the camp of Jacob. So he's saying there is these two forces camped together, and one is God's camp and one is his own camp. So Jacob, because he's returning to the land where his brother lives, decides to send a message to his brother Esau to let him know that he's about to return. And he says in verse 5, so that I might find favor in your eyes. Jacob knows that his brother is not on good terms with him, so he's sending a messenger to let him know that he's coming back so that he can find favor in his eyes. And then the messengers find Esau, they deliver the message, and then they come back to Jacob and they say, yes, your brother knows that you're coming, and by the way, he's on his way to meet you with 400 men. So that doesn't sound like a positive reception, and Jacob is now, we're told, in great fear and distress because he knows that his brother is on his way to meet him with a whole lot of people. And Jacob's response is to divide all of his possessions into two camps, because he thought, and this is verse 8, if Esau comes and attacks one camp or one portion of his family and possessions, maybe the other would be left to escape. So Jacob is looking at all of his flocks and herds, his wives and his children, and he's dividing them up and saying, maybe if one group is decimated by Esau, the other group might have a chance to escape. And Jacob essentially sorts these groups according to the way that he values them. So he puts his flocks and herds in front, then he puts certain family members in the middle, and the ones that are nearest and dearest to him are at the end, and he's hopeful that maybe they'll be able to escape. So that just gives us an insight into Jacob's mindset. And then he's left alone. Jacob is left alone. He's feeling desperate. We're told he's in fear and distress. He knows his brother's rolling out to meet him with 400 people. And so Jacob prays. And I'm going to read this prayer to you. This is from verses 9 through 12. This is a prayer that Jacob offers to God. He says, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper.' I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan River, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you, God, have said, 'I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted.'" This is the prayer of a desperate man. He is calling out to God. He's reminding God of God's promises to him, and he's kind of asking God, "You need to come through for me here. I am terrified." He's asking for God's help. Then we're told that Jacob puts together a gift of goats, sheep, camels, cows, and donkeys, and sent each herd along with a servant, each as a gift to Esau. So I want you to see, this is a parade of 550 animals. That's a lot of animals. Each of them divided up by flock with a servant, and he lines them up and spaces them out and sends them off to meet his brother Esau. And this is intentionally a gift meant to pacify his brother's anger. I read some great stuff about this week. I want you to imagine this, and I want you to picture this. Esau is marching off to meet Jacob with 400 men, which signals like a military function. It doesn't look good. But here he's met with this parade of animals coming towards him, and the commentators were pointing out, as each of these flocks would arrive, Esau would have to incorporate them into this collection of 400 men, which probably slowed him down a bit. And if he's got 400 men met with 550 animals, that's an animal per person plus some. And so they said the other thing to think about is that possibly these 400 men had agreed to go with Esau in hopes that they might collect some of Jacob's possessions for themselves. And here Jacob's just offering them up without a fight. So there's a little bit of psychological activity going on here with Jacob sending all these presents and gifts to his brother. So the goal here is to try to soften Esau up before they meet face to face. So in verse 21, we're told that Jacob's gifts went on ahead of him, but he himself spent the night in the camp. And you've probably heard the word camp many times in this passage. That's intentional. That night, Jacob got up, took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And you're meant to hear this echo several times, that Jacob is by himself. He's prayed to God, and now he's sent across the river all of his nearest and dearest, and he is left by himself. Jacob felt vulnerable, and he had nothing left with him. He was alone with no options left but to rely on God. And as I was thinking about this week, I was wondering, have any of you ever experienced something like this? A moment where you have felt very alone. A moment where you feel like your options have dwindled, where all you have left is to cry out to God for help. A moment of desperation when you have thought, I don't know how this is going to end, but I hope that God is with me. This is where Jacob is in this moment. It's a crisis moment in his life. He is feeling very alone. He calls out to God, and it's in this context that a man arrives, a no-named man at night arrives and wrestles with Jacob. And we read this story, sometimes it's familiar that you're just like, of course, that's what happens. But think about that for a minute. A man shows up when he's left alone at the darkest moment of his life and challenges him to a wrestling match. Why? I have no idea. I have so many questions. Where did this man come from? Who was he? Why did he initiate a wrestling match with a stranger in the middle of the night? And why was this man so eager to get away before the sun rose? Because that's part of the dynamic here. I have no idea how to answer those questions. I'm not even going to try, but I think they're fascinating to think about. We're told that the man saw he couldn't overpower Jacob. And remember, Jacob's name means heel grabber. There's an element of wrestling in Jacob's name itself. But this man has realized he can't overpower Jacob, so he touches the socket of Jacob's hip and wrenches it in order to sort of cheat and end the match. This is fascinating to me. But Jacob, the tenacious heel grabber, refuses to let go. He clings to the man and demands a blessing. And that's why I told you that story about when fires happen, how important it is to have these things that you can cling to that give some sort of evidence of meaning and purpose and location when you feel like things are falling apart in your life. I think that's what's happening here. Jacob is holding on for dear life and he's praying to God and he's asking for a blessing. So I think that's really interesting. Jacob seemed to know that who he was wrestling was not just your average person. He seems to know that something is going on here because he asks for a blessing. He may be wondering if this is a messenger from God. Remember, he saw these angels before this moment. He may think that God has sent a messenger here to wrestle with him. We don't really know what's in his head, but something about the dynamic and the conversation they have leads us to believe that at some point Jacob figured out that this was a supernatural being that he was wrestling with. Friends, God started this wrestling match with Jacob. This is God's initiative with him. And I wonder if any of us have had moments where we have felt like we've needed to wrestle with God. Moments when we felt alone and found ourselves wrestling with who God is and what God is doing in our lives. The other thing I want to point out is that the God of the universe is more than capable of pinning Jacob in this moment, but he allows Jacob to hang on to him. He allows Jacob to ask for this blessing. And also, we see the God of the universe is not unwilling to wrestle with us, to wrestle with human beings and with our questions. So I want you to think about, what does this tell us about who God is? That he's willing to enter into a wrestling match with a human. God is willing to wrestle with our questions. God is willing to experience that kind of encounter with us. The other thing I really want you to see is that encountering God leads to transformation. Jacob is radically transformed by this interaction. When I first became a believer, I had my own moment of wrestling with God. I had grown up in a Christian home, but that didn't mean I didn't have questions. I had a lot of questions. I am, by personality, a challenger. I don't tend to take things on surface value. I have questions. I want answers. And one of the things that I really struggled with God early on was the fact that every single Christian I knew, some of those who lived in my own household, did not seem to live lives that matched up to what they professed to believe. I really struggled with the fact that most Christians I knew did not seem to live out their faith in a way that I found matching God's call. And so I asked God, why would I follow you when every example I know of a Christ follower is a hypocrite? I need answers. And I wrestled with God on that. And I remember being at a camp and really having this conversation with God, and I felt like God's response to me was, some questions you don't get answered. And I had to come to terms with that because I really like answers. But I found early on, and I have found many times since, that what God offers in replacement of conclusive answers to every question, God offers more of himself. And I think in the end, that was what God was saying to me. Do you want a relationship with God Or do you want to have control over God by getting all of your questions answered? Which brings us to the third point, a new name and a limp. Because I think Jacob has his own wrestling match with God. He wants answers, and God is saying, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the only answer you get is more of God. So the man, who is God in this scenario, asks Jacob, what is your name? And when Jacob says his name, remember, his name sounds like heel grabber. So Jacob has to admit that he's a schemer, he's a trickster, he's a cheater, because that's what his name means. So when the man asks him for his name, Jacob has to admit out loud, well, I'm a bit of a heel grabber. That's who I am. That's what people say about me. All his life, Jacob had relied on trickery, deceit, scheming to get what he wanted. His interactions with his uncle Laban had been the first time he'd ever been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment. And now this man, God's messenger, had used the same sort of trickery to wound Jacob and to end their wrestling match. And this man gave Jacob a new name, the name Israel, which means one who has struggled or wrestled with God and with humans and has overcome. So Jacob in this moment goes from being a heel grabber to becoming a God wrestler, which I kind of love. That's the name he carries for the rest of his life. Jacob asks this man for his identity, which is just kind of Jacob showing his control issues, right? He wants to know who he's dealing with for sure. But the man refused to tell him and refused to give a reason why. God doesn't have to give us answers. But then this man blessed Jacob. And Jacob renamed the location of this wrestling match Peniel, which means the face of God. He's recognizing that he has seen God face to face. Jacob knew who he'd been wrestling with. At the end of the day, and probably his entire life, his wrestling match has been with God. We're told that the sun rose as Jacob walked away from this wrestling match, and he walked away with a limp. God made sure that Jacob would never forget this moment. He's going to carry this limp for the rest of his life. And God made sure that Jacob remembered that God was the one who won this wrestling match. So Jacob has a new name and a permanent limp, and I want us to see again that Jacob encountered God, and that encounter transformed his entire life. So I have two questions for us this morning to talk about around your tables. The first is, what does this story tell us about God? Who is God, and how is God encountering Jacob in this moment? What does this tell us about God? And the second is, how was Jacob transformed by this encounter? How did this change who Jacob is? So go ahead and spend a few minutes talking about this around your tables, and then we'll finish up. Every week as we've been going through these stories, hopefully you figured this out now, I've been asking you two questions. And the first is, who is the person credited with collecting the stories of Genesis? Moses. Oh, you guys are getting so good. Okay. And what do we remember about Moses? What is Moses' big story? The Exodus. Okay. So Jacob, who gets the name Israel, becomes the father of the Israelites. And so Moses is telling the people of Israel this story about their father, Israel, which is just fascinating if you stop and think about it. Jacob is on the edge of returning to Canaan, the promised land. And when Moses tells them this story, the Israelites this story, they are also on the edge of returning to the promised land. And they were running in fear from slavery in Egypt, from the people in Egypt, and facing potentially their enemies in the land of Canaan. So they would have had this same sense of being caught between two enemies and having their own wrestling match with whether or not they will truly trust in who God is. And here they're being told that their identity is the same as Jacob. They are also God wrestlers, which is fascinating. That is the name of the people of Israel. They are people who wrestle with God. Now, the story ends, I'm just going to tie it in a bow. When Jacob finally does encounter Esau, they actually have a lovely reunion. So it doesn't turn out to be something that Jacob needed to fear. Maybe it's because Jacob sent him all those animals. I don't really know. But in the end, Jacob's family was not wiped out. They met and they were reconciled and able to move forward together. But Jacob didn't know that at the beginning of the story. The Israelites would go on to have their own encounters with God, and they also would experience transformation. And friends, this is our story too. We have our own encounters with God. We experience transformation with God, and sometimes that happens in the context of a wrestling match. God is not afraid of that. God is not afraid of our questions. God is willing, we have a God who is willing to enter into those kinds of wrestling moments where we come to God and we cling to God, begging for a blessing. God is open to that and welcomes that from us. And we have a God who is willing to transform us through these very personal encounters. So let's pray together and we'll continue with our time at the Lord's table.